"I'll feed you and your baby, but you're staying here forever," the rancher declared. When she tried to run, snow drove across the prairie like a white wall, pushing the wind into the bones of anyone foolish enough to be outside, and yet she walked because there was no other choice. Nora Hale tightened her shawl around the baby pressed to her chest and kept her head down, step by slow step, following the trace of a wagon road that vanished under drifts as soon as the wind touched it. She had the look of a woman who had fought the world and learned to keep her jaw steady, a widowed schoolteacher who still carried chalk under her nails and hope in a small pocket of her heart. The baby fussed, then quieted when she murmured a low tune, her voice soft and steady, the sound almost taken by the storm. The light had gone blue and thin, the kind of a light that warned of night and wolves and bad luck. When the horse appeared out of the white, she thought it was a ghost. Then the rider's shape formed broad shoulders, a thick coat, a hat crusted with ice, and she froze because there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. He reined in close, towering even on horseback. His face was a map of cold and old grief, the kind that set deep lines around the mouth and made the eyes watchful. He looked at the baby first, then at Nora, as if weighing something heavy inside. "You'll die out here," he said in a low voice that carried through the wind. Simple words, true words. He swung down and came toward her, and she held tighter to the child without meaning to, because men had taken too much from her for too long. He did not reach for her, not right away. He took off a thick wool blanket from his saddle, shook the snow from it, and lifted it so she could step into its heat. "Take it," he said, no argument. She took it because he was right, because her teeth were shaking and her fingers had gone numb, and because the baby's tiny breath had turned too light. He wrapped the blanket around mother and child with big, careful hands, the sort of hands that knew hard work and the weight of a colt and the small tug of a child's weight too. Then he said, "There's a ranch 2 miles west. Mine. You're coming now." She wanted to ask his name. She wanted to say she had no need of a stranger's mercy. But his horse, dark and patient and steaming in the cold, stood between her and the trail like a wall, and her legs wobbled beneath her. "I can pay," she said. "I work. I teach letters. I can cook some. I'll pay my way." He nodded once, as if that settled it, but his eyes stayed on her face. "You'll pay by staying alive." He picked up a small shape from the snow by her boot, a bit of wood she hadn't noticed falling from her sack when the wind tore it open. A carved wooden sparrow, sanded smooth, the one thing she had made on long nights so her baby would have something to hold. He brushed snow from its wings and set it gently into her glove. "Keep that where the child can find it," he said. "Small hands need something to hold." Then he lifted her with the kind of care that made heat rise to her eyes and set her on the horse before him, one arm steady around her to shield the baby from the wind. The land rolled under them, white and endless, fence posts sticking out like broken stitches, the dim line of cottonwoods guiding them toward a low set of buildings squatting against the storm. When the ranch came into view, a long house with smoke fighting up from the chimney, a barn tucked close, sheds crouched like dogs in the cold, Nora felt the tight knot of fear loosen just enough for breath. He swung her down at the porch and shouldered the door open. Warmth hit like a blow. Firelight, the scent of beef and onions, the sharp, homely smell of wood smoke and soap. He took the baby first, and that surprised her. He removed his gloves slow, like someone approaching a skittish colt, and tucked the child into the crook of his arm with a surety that spoke of practice. "Name?" he asked, eyes on the baby. "Thomas," she said. "He's 5 months." "Thomas," he repeated, as if the name were a binding. He held the boy toward the fire and rubbed small circles on his back until a thin cry broke into a healthy wail. Only then did he look at Nora. "I'm Eli Turner," he said. "This place is Turner Ranch, 3 miles from Bitter Creek Town. You and the boy are staying. You'll have food, warmth, a doctor if he can be fetched." His gaze did not waver. "You try to step back into that storm, I'll carry you to the cellar and bar the door myself. I'll feed you and your baby, but you're staying here forever." The words struck her like a thrown rope, rough and sure. She flinched, pride sparking first because he had no right. Then the pride met the memory of the road, the empty purse, the cold under her skin, and the quiet terror of a fever in a child far from help, and her breath shook once. "You talk like you own the land and the sky," she said. He shrugged, a slow roll of broad shoulders. "I own this roof. It's enough for today." He ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the table, cut thick slices of bread, poured hot coffee and said nothing more, letting the food speak its spell. She ate, shame mixing with relief so fierce it made her eyes burn. Eli moved like a man used to silence. He fed the fire, checked the window latches, hung the wet blanket near the hearth, and watched the baby with the same steady focus he'd given the colt of a mare. When Thomas quieted and drifted to sleep with a wooden sparrow tucked against his belly, Nora's shoulders loosened for the first time in days. She looked around the room, the neat rows of tools on the wall, the mended quilt folded on a chair, the single narrow bed pushed against a log wall, a second pallet rolled tight beneath it, and understood he lived alone, not slovenly, not mean, just alone for too long. "Why? Forever?" she asked at last, voice rough with warmth and weariness. "Because men hunt what's weak in winter," he said, eyes on the window where the storm pressed its white hands against the glass. "You're not weak, but they'll count on the weather to cut you down. A woman alone with a baby draws wolves 2-legged and 4. I won't have it on my land. I won't see you buried here come thaw." He set another log on the fire, sparks clicking up like little lights. "We'll talk terms when you can feel your fingers. Work is honest. I have plenty. You'll teach a small school here, for my hands and any neighbour child who can ride in. I'll pay in coin and beef. If you want marriage talk, that's later, not today. Today is for breathing." His words were short, plain, like fence posts driven straight. Still, something in them, some quiet promise, reached into the place in her that had only known rough orders and false vows. She wrapped her hands around the mug and let the heat burn away the last of the storm clinging to her skin. That night, when the house slept, the wind eased to a long sigh, and the snow's hiss softened. Eli bedded the horses and came in with frost in his beard. He paused at the crib he'd made in a hurry from a deep drawer lined with the mended quilt. Thomas lay there with his fist around the carved sparrow, lips moving in some baby dream. Eli's eyes changed when he looked at that small fist. Nora watched from the bed's edge, feeling the prickle of a truth she could not yet hold. In the quiet, she noticed another carving on the mantel, a small wooden horse, worn smooth by many hands. She almost asked about it. She did not. It had the feel of a grave marker and a keepsake both, something that explained the lonely rooms and the way the man guarded his land like a wounded thing. She lay back and listened to the house settle around them, to the wood sigh and the fire crack. The storm had locked the world outside. Inside, the strange peace of heat and quiet and a man's steady breathing set a new rhythm. She did not know if she was safe. Not yet. But for the first time since the road took her husband and left her with a child and a sack of worry, she slept, and the ranch held her as if it meant to keep her. The morning broke pale and muffled, the snow still deep enough to hide the shape of the land. Nora woke to the scent of coffee and the creak of boots on the porch. Eli had been up before the first hint of dawn. She could tell by the way the fire was already high, and the room smelled faintly of the cold he'd carried in on his coat. Thomas still slept, the carved sparrow tucked under his chin, his tiny breath steady and even. For a moment she let herself watch him, that fragile little chest rising, the lashes trembling against his cheeks, and she thought of how close the storm had come to taking them. Eli came in without knocking, his boots leaving clumps of snow on the floorboards. He looked at her, then at the baby, as if checking both were still there. "There's oatmeal on the stove," he said simply, setting down a pail of water that steamed in the cold air. "I'll take Thomas for a bit so you can eat." He didn't wait for her to agree. He just crossed the room, careful in his big frame, and bent to lift the child with a steadiness that made her throat ache. Thomas stirred, blinked once, and then curled into the crook of his arm like he knew the man already. Nora wanted to bristle at the assumption, but there was no sharpness in Eli's movements, only a quiet certainty, as if he'd made up his mind that caring for them was now his work as much as mending a fence or feeding cattle. She took the bowl, ate slow and deliberate, letting the warmth push the night's cold from her bones. He paced the length of the room with the baby, murmuring low not words she could catch, just a steady hum that seemed older than language. When she finished, he handed Thomas back and pulled a chair to the table. "Storm's easing," he said. "Tracks on the north fence line 2 riders. They didn't come close, but they were watching. Nora felt the old knot of fear tighten again. Who? He shrugged, the motion heavy. Could be drifters, could be worse. The sheriff doesn't bother this far out unless he has to, and some men don't like the law seeing what they're after. His gaze fixed on her, steady and unblinking. That's why I said you'd stay, not because I like giving orders, because I've buried enough out here. She wanted to ask him what he meant, who he had buried, but the set of his jaw warned her off. Instead, she asked, "Do you think they were after me?" "Don't know yet," he said, "but you don't leave the yard unless I'm with you. Not until I'm sure." The firmness in his tone made her bristle again, but she kept her mouth shut. She had learned the hard way that pride could be expensive. Still, part of her wanted to prove she wasn't a helpless thing to be locked away. After breakfast, he took her on a walk of the property. The snow crunched under their boots, the air sharp enough to make her eyes water. The house sat with its back to a low ridge, sheltering it from the worst of the wind. The barn stood close, painted red once, but now faded to a rusted brown. Beyond it, corrals and a wide stretch of pasture, all white now, the fence rails heavy with snow. He pointed out the spring house, the smoke house, the chicken coop, each with its own path trampled through the drifts. She noticed he kept glancing toward the ridge and the north fence, his hand never far from the rifle slung over his shoulder. They reached the barn, and the warmth of the animals inside wrapped around them. Horses stamped in their stalls, the smell of hay and leather filling the air. Eli checked each one with quiet efficiency, patting a neck here, tightening a cinch there. He introduced her to a big bay mare named Daisy, who sniffed her hair and huffed into her scarf. Nora smiled despite herself. "You'll help with the eggs and chickens," Eli said as they left the barn. "In time, you can help with lessons for the Hands children. I've got men, working the far pastures hard men, but they respect what's mine." Something in his tone made her glance at him. "And you've decided I'm yours?" His eyes met hers, unflinching. "While you're under this roof, yes." He didn't say it like a claim, more like a fact of the land. Snow was cold, wind was cruel, and if you sheltered here, you stayed until it was safe. That night, after supper, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint at first, a distant whinny, the creak of saddle leather. Eli set his fork down and moved to the window, lifting the curtain with one finger. "What is it?" Nora asked. "Riders," he said quietly. "Two of them again, same as this morning, stopping just past the fence." Her heart thudded. "Are they from town?" "No," he said. "No horses like that in Bitter Creek." He watched for a long moment, then let the curtain fall. "They're testing my patience." He moved to the corner, took down the rifle from its rack and began to check it. Nora felt the air in the room change thicker, tighter, as if the walls themselves knew trouble was close. "Stay inside," he said. "Lock the door if I'm not here." She almost asked where he was going, but his expression told her it wasn't a request for conversation. He pulled on his coat, stepped into the cold, and was swallowed by the white. She stood at the window, Thomas warm in her arms, and watched his shape vanish into the dark. Minutes dragged like hours. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Then came the sound of hooves, fast, sharp, retreating. Eli returned without a word, snow in his beard and something grim in his eyes. He set the rifle back in its place, checked the latch on the door, and sat by the fire without explaining. Nora waited, but when he finally spoke, his voice was low. "They won't try the fence tonight, but they will come closer next time." He didn't say it to frighten her. He said it the way a man might speak about a storm on the horizon, inevitable, patient, and dangerous. And for the first time, she wondered if Eli Turner's forever wasn't just stubbornness, but a promise he meant to keep at any cost. The next morning, the world outside was a glittering trap sunlight spilled over the snow, dazzling enough to make Nora squint, but the cold bit sharper than any blade. She could see her breath curling in the air even inside the kitchen. Eli was already up, moving with the steady rhythm of a man who knew his chores by heart. He had a way of making the room feel smaller when he moved, not because he crowded her, but because every step he took seemed deliberate, like there was nothing outside his reach if he wanted it. Thomas gurgled from his makeshift crib, kicking his blanket, the carved sparrow clutched in one small fist. Eli crouched beside him, big hand gentle as he adjusted the quilt. "Strong grip," he murmured, almost to himself. Nora caught the faintest softness in his voice, like a man speaking to something fragile and rare. After breakfast, Eli announced he'd be riding to the east pasture to check the herd. "You'll stay close to the house," he said, his eyes holding hers until she nodded. "If you see anyone you don't know, you take Thomas into the root cellar. Lock it from the inside. Understand?" She did, though the idea of huddling in the dark earth made her skin crawl. Still, there was something about the way he said it, firm but not cruel, that made her agree without argument. He left her with a pile of laundry to sort and the promise that he'd be back before sundown. When the sound of his horse faded into the distance, the silence in the house felt heavy. She set to work, humming to Thomas as she washed and hung the clothes by the fire. Outside, the snow caught the sun in a million small sparks. It looked peaceful enough to make her doubt the tension in Eli's eyes the night before. By midday, she'd grown restless. She bundled Thomas into his thickest blankets and stepped out onto the porch. The air was so crisp it seemed to shatter in her lungs. The land rolled white in every direction, the fence's neat black lines against the snow. She walked just far enough to stretch her legs, staying within sight of the house. That's when she saw it, just a flicker of movement on the far ridge. She froze, tightening her hold on Thomas. At first, she thought it might be a deer, but then the sun caught on metal saddle hardware, maybe a rifle barrel, a rider, maybe two. They didn't move toward the ranch, just stood there, watching. Her heart thumped hard in her ears. She forced herself to turn, slow and steady, and walk back to the porch. She locked the door behind her, then went to the window. The ridge was empty now, no movement, no shine of metal. But she knew what she'd seen. The hours stretched after that. She kept busy feeding Thomas, mending a tear in one of Eli's shirts, stirring the pot of beans on the stove, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. She jumped at the creak of the barn door in the wind, at the pop of a log in the fire. The shadows had started to lengthen when the crunch of hooves reached her ears. Relief loosened her chest. Eli was back. She opened the door, the cold rushing in like a living thing, and there he was, riding up the path, hat pulled low, scarf up over his face. But the moment he dismounted, she saw something different in him. Tighter shoulders, eyes scanning the tree line before they settled on her. He handed her a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "For the baby," he said. Inside were 2 jars of milk and a wedge of soft cheese, cold from the saddlebag. "Neighbour's cow calved early. He owed me." "Eli," she began, holding the bundle, "I saw someone today, on the ridge." He didn't ask which ridge. He just set his jaw. "Describe them." "I couldn't see their faces, just 2 riders, watching." His gaze drifted past her shoulder, toward the window, as if he could still catch sight of them. "They're getting bolder," he said finally. "They want me to. Know they're out there." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because I have something they want. And now, that includes you." The word struck hard. She'd been hunted before, by debt collectors, by her late husband's enemies. But hearing him say it with such certainty made it feel different, heavier. That night, after Thomas was asleep, she found herself staring at the small wooden horse on the mantel. Its edges were worn smooth, the legs a little uneven. It looked like the kind of thing a man might carve on long winter nights, over and over, until the memory in his hands matched the one in his head. She wanted to ask who it was for, but Eli was outside, checking the barn again despite the cold. When he came back in, snow clinging to his coat, he caught her looking at the carving. "You wondering about that?" She hesitated, then nodded. He didn't come closer. "Made it for my boy. Long time ago." His voice was flat, but there was a shadow in it. "He's gone now." Nora's fingers tightened around her mug. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Eli gave a small shrug, the kind men use when they've learned not to dwell too long on certain memories. "Keep that sparrow close for Thomas. Things like that, they matter more than you think." She thought of the riders, of the long empty road that had nearly taken them, of this house standing stubborn against the cold. Maybe he was right. But as she lay in bed that night, the fire low, the wind whispering against the walls, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ridge wasn't as far away as it seemed, and that whatever those men wanted, they might not wait much longer to come for it. The following days slid into a rhythm that was steady on the surface but tense underneath, like a river flowing over hidden rocks. Eli left early each morning to ride the boundaries. sometimes not returning until the sun was low and the shadows stretched long across the snow. Nora kept to her chores, feeding the chickens, cooking, tending Thomas, but her eyes were always drawn to the ridges, to the thin black lines of fence where the land met the sky. Eli spoke little about what he saw out there. He would come in, hang up his coat, check on Thomas, and only then mention if the day had been quiet or if he'd found tracks again. She learned to read his silences. When he was more careful, setting his rifle back on the rack, when his boots carried a little more snow inside, she knew he'd been watching someone who was also watching him. It was late afternoon when the knock came, a sharp, deliberate rap on the front door. Nora's head jerked up from the mending in her lap. Thomas stirred in his crib, sensing the change in the air. Eli wasn't back yet. Her first thought was to follow his instructions and take Thomas to the cellar. But the knock came again, slower this time, and a voice followed. "Ma'am?" "I'm from town, just want a word." The voice was smooth, almost friendly, but it made her skin crawl. She rose slowly, moving to the window beside the door. A man sat his horse just beyond the porch, his coat too fine for a ranch hand, his hat low over eyes she couldn't quite see. Behind him, another rider waited, bulkier, his horse pawing the snow. "What do you want?" she called, keeping the door shut. The man tipped his hat in mock politeness. "Looking for a woman matching your description, travelling with a baby. You seen her?" Her heart thudded, but she kept her voice level. "No one like that here." He smiled without warmth. "Funny, I heard different. Folks say Turner's taken in some company. You might be her." She didn't answer. The man leaned a little in the saddle. "Tell you what, you come with us, no trouble. We'll make sure the boy's cared for." The cold in his tone made her stomach twist. She stepped back from the door, fighting the urge to look toward the ridge where she'd last seen riders. She didn't need to. These were the same men, she knew it. "Leave," she said, louder than she meant to. The smile slipped from his face. "You think Turner can keep you safe forever? He can't even keep his own." He cut himself off, eyes flicking past her shoulder. A voice came from behind the barn, deep and sharp as a rifle crack. "You've got 5 seconds to be off my land." Eli's boots crunched in the snow as he stepped into view, rifle raised, his stance loose but certain. The two men exchanged a glance. The smaller one gave Nora a long, deliberate look, then jerked his reins. The horses turned, snow scattering under their hooves, and they rode off toward the north fence. Eli didn't lower the rifle until they were a speck against the horizon. Then he came to the porch, opened the door, and stepped inside, the cold curling around him. "You all right?" Nora nodded, but her hands trembled. "They knew about me, about Thomas." "I know," he said. His tone was calm, but there was a muscle tight in his jaw. "That's why they came. They were testing the door, seeing if they could pull you out easy." She swallowed. "Who are they?" "Men who work for someone I've crossed before," he said after a moment. "They'll try again." Her voice was low. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" His eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. "Because I didn't want you running off into the snow thinking it was safer. Out here, running just makes you easier to catch." Something in her chest loosened. Not quite trust, but the first shadow of it. Still, she hated the idea of being kept in the dark. "If they come back, they will," he said, cutting her off gently. "And when they do, we'll be ready." That night, the air in the house felt heavier. Eli moved through his chores with a quiet purpose, checking the locks, loading the rifle, and setting an extra lamp near the window. Nora rocked Thomas, the carved sparrow warm in his small hand, and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Just before she went to bed, she noticed Eli at the mantel, his fingers brushing the wooden horse. He stood there for a long moment, then set it back exactly where it had been, as if it marked a boundary only he understood. She wanted to ask again about the boy he'd carved it for, about how he'd been lost. But something about the set of his shoulders told her now wasn't the time. Instead, she lay awake listening to the wind and the faint creak of Eli's boots as he paced the porch, a shadow moving against the snow. And she realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. Part of her was no longer thinking about how to leave. She was thinking about what it would take to stay. But before the thought could settle, a sound split the night, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight. Not the wind, not the barn, something closer. Eli was already moving, the front door swinging open, the cold rushing in. His voice was low, urgent. Stay inside, lock it. She clutched Thomas close and did as he said, but when she pressed her ear to the wood, she could hear voices in the dark. Low, angry, too close to the house. The voices outside were muffled at first, carried by the wind, but close enough that Nora could make out the rhythm, if not the exact words. One was low and measured, the other sharper, impatient. Thomas stirred against her chest, sensing the tension in her grip. She backed away from the door, her mind racing through Eli's instruction cellar, lock from the inside, but her feet refused to move. The thought of leaving him out there alone with those men made her feel rooted in place. Through the small gap in the curtain, she caught sight of the porch. Eli stood at the edge, rifle held loose but ready, the lamp behind him throwing his shadow long across the snow. Beyond the yard fence, two figures lingered, dark shapes against the pale drifts, their horses shifting restlessly. The taller of the two called out, "Turner, you know why we're here." Eli's voice carried back, even and steady. "Not interested. You think you can keep her from us?" The man's tone was almost amused. "She's not yours to keep." "She's under my roof," Eli said. "That makes her mine to protect." The words sent a strange heat through Nora's chest. The man laughed, a short, cold sound. "You've been holding grudges a long time, Turner. Maybe you should think about how that worked out for your boy." Nora's breath caught. Eli didn't move, didn't speak right away. Then his voice dropped to something even colder than the wind. "You've got 10 seconds to leave my land." There was a pause, then the creak of saddle leather and the crunch of hooves turning away. The shapes faded into the dark, their voices swallowed by the snow. Eli came back in, shutting the door firmly behind him. He set the rifle in its place, his movements deliberate, almost too controlled. Nora wanted to ask what they meant about his boy, but she bit the question back. His face was a wall, and she sensed the wrong word might crack something better left whole for now. "They won't try anything tonight," he said instead. "But they will come back. You keep to the house, Nora. Promise me." She met his gaze. "I promise." The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. She lay awake listening to the faint sound of Eli's boots on the porch, the creak of wood as he shifted his weight, the whisper of wind against the walls. Morning brought a brittle, glassy cold. Frost rimed the inside edges of the window panes, and the snow outside was crusted hard from the night's freeze. Eli was already gone when she woke, a note on the table in his tight, blunt handwriting. "Checking the east fence. Stay inside. Back by midday." Nora did her best to keep busy feeding Thomas, stoking the fire, mending one of Eli's worn flannel shirts. But the house felt too quiet, the silence a constant reminder of the night before. Every creak of the beams, every thump of snow sliding from the roof made her glance toward the window. She was hanging the shirt by the hearth when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunch in the snow, not from the direction of the barn or the road. She froze, her ears straining. The sound grew louder, closer, until a shadow moved across the kitchen window. Before she could react, there was another knock on the front door. Not the sharp, deliberate rap from before. This one was softer, almost hesitant. Against her better judgment, she went to the door and called through it. "Who is it?" A pause, then a voice she didn't recognize. "Mom, I need help. My horse threw me in the gully. I can't walk far in this cold." It was a younger man's voice, thin with strain. Something about it tugged at her, but the warning in Eli's eyes the night before rang in her head. "I can't open the door," she said firmly. "There's a town 3 miles south. You can get help there." "Please," the voice said again, breaking on the word. "It's my leg." She hesitated. Thomas shifted in her arms, making a small noise, and she glanced down at him. When she looked back toward the door, the shadow was gone. A prickle ran along her spine. She moved to the side window, peering out carefully. The yard was empty. No man. No tracks in the snow that hadn't been there before. Her stomach dropped. She backed away from the window and went to the corner where Eli kept the revolver, checking the chamber the way he'd shown her the day before. She carried it with her as she paced the room, her ears tuned to every sound outside. It was nearly an hour later when Eli returned, snow dusting his coat. He took one look at her face and his expression hardened. "What happened?" She told him about the knock, the voice, the empty yard. He listened without interrupting, then crossed to the window and studied the yard himself. "They were testing you," he said finally. "Seeing if you'd open the door." Her throat was dry. "If I had, they'd have been inside before you could blink." His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that settled heavy in her chest. He took the revolver from her, checked it, then set it back within her reach. "If they come again when I'm gone, you shoot first. Don't warn them, don't open the door, understood?" She nodded, her fingers still tingling from gripping the gun. Eli looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I'll double the watch on the fences, and I'll be sleeping in the chair by the door from now on." That night, true to his word, he sat near the door with the rifle across his knees, eyes half closed but never fully resting. Nora lay in the bed with Thomas, the glow of the fire casting Eli's shadow large against the wall. She realized then that whatever was coming, he meant to meet it, head on no matter the cost. And for the first time, she let herself believe he might just keep them safe. But the question that lingered, sharp as the cold, was for how long? By the next morning, the air carried the brittle clarity that comes after a hard freeze. The sky was an endless pale blue, the snow so bright it stung the eyes. Eli didn't go out right away. Instead, he stayed by the window, scanning the yard with the same patience she'd seen in a man watching for game. His coffee sat untouched on the table. "They won't try again in daylight," Nora said quietly, bouncing Thomas against her shoulder. Eli's mouth ticked in a humorless smile. "You'd be surprised what some men will do in daylight if they think they're quick enough." He finally stepped away from the window, pulling on his coat. "I'll be in the barn checking the tack. You stay inside." He hesitated a beat, his eyes flicking to Thomas. "Keep the revolver close." Nora watched him go, the door shutting with a dull thump that seemed to leave the room emptier than it had been. She went about her chores, feeding the fire, stirring the stew pot, folding laundry, but every few minutes her gaze slid back to the window. It was while she was hanging Eli's shirts on a chair near the hearth that she saw it. Movement at the tree line beyond the north fence. A lone rider, sitting so still he might have been carved from the same wood as the fence posts. She couldn't see his face under the brim of his hat, but she could feel his eyes on the house. Her fingers clenched around the shirt in her hands. She set it down slowly, moving toward the revolver on the shelf. Thomas cooed in his crib, unaware of the way the world outside was shrinking toward them. The rider didn't move. Not forward, not back, just watched. She thought about calling for Eli, but the barn was far enough that her voice might not reach. And part of her wondered if this was another test, if they wanted her to panic, to run out into the open. Instead, she picked up the revolver and stood where he could see her. The man tipped his hat once slow, mocking, and turned his horse, disappearing into the trees. Her pulse was still pounding when Eli came back in. One look at her face, and he set down the saddle blanket he was carrying. "What happened?" she told him. His jaw tightened, but he didn't curse or shout. He just walked to the window, scanning the tree line. "They're getting bolder," he said finally. "They want you to know they're out there." "Why?" she asked. The word came out sharper than she intended. "What is it they want from me? I have nothing." Eli's eyes shifted from the trees to her. "It's not what you have. It's who you are." Her breath caught. "You mean because I'm alone, with a child?" "And because you're under my roof," he said. "They're not just testing you, Nora. They're testing me. They want to see if I'll break like I did before." The words hung there, heavy and unspoken between them. She thought of the wooden horse on the mantel, of the way his voice had changed when he mentioned his boy. She didn't ask this time, didn't need to. Some losses were clear without details. The rest of the day passed in tense quiet. Eli worked near the house, mending a section of fence and hauling in extra wood, never out of sight of the windows. Nora cooked, cleaned, and kept Thomas warm. But her mind kept returning to that lone rider and the way he'd tipped his hat. As dusk fell, Eli brought in a bundle of kindling and set it by the hearth. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm riding into Bitter Creek. Need to speak to someone about these men." Nora's stomach tightened. "You're leaving me here?" His gaze met hers steady. "I'll be gone half the day. You'll stay inside with the door locked. Rifle by the window, revolver by the stove. If anyone comes near, you don't wait to see who they are." She wanted to argue, but the memory of the rider's mocking tip of the hat kept her quiet. That night, after Thomas was asleep, she found herself restless. She walked to the mantel and picked up the carved sparrow. The wood was warm from the fire, its edges smoothed by her own hands over the past days. She thought of Eli carving it, hands steady despite the storm outside, and wondered if he'd known then that she'd need it as much as the baby did. When she set it back, she caught Eli watching her from his chair by the door. His eyes held something she couldn't quite name, part warning, part promise. "You're not going to lose us," she said quietly, surprising herself. His gaze didn't waver. "I won't," he said. "Not while I'm breathing." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of horses somewhere beyond the ridge. And in that moment, Nora realized something she hadn't before. Eli wasn't just guarding her from danger. He was daring it to come to his door. Eli left before sunrise, the sky still a deep indigo with only a faint wash of light on the horizon. Nora heard the low rumble of his voice as he spoke to his horse, the sound carrying through the thin winter air, and then the muffled thud of the hooves fading into the distance. The house felt too still after he was gone, as if even the fire hesitated without his steady hand to tend it. She kept herself busy feeding Thomas, sweeping the floor, checking the stew pot she'd set to simmer the night before. The revolver rested on the shelf within easy reach, its presence both reassuring and unnerving. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the wind outside made her glance toward it. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed enough to turn the snow blinding white. Nora pulled the curtain back to check the yard, her eyes sweeping instinctively toward the north fence. At first, all she saw was the sharp blue shadow of the ridge. Then her breath caught. A figure stood just beyond the fence line, still as stone. It wasn't the same rider she'd seen before. This one was on foot, a thick coat pulled close, a scarf covering most of his face. He had something in his hand, though she couldn't tell what from this distance. She stepped back from the window, heart thudding, and reached for the revolver. Thomas was fussing in his crib, sensing her tension, his small hands waving in the air. The man didn't move closer. Instead, he bent down and set something on the snow just inside the fence, then turned and walked back toward the trees. She waited at the window until he vanished into the shadows. For a long moment, she stayed frozen in place. Then, after checking the yard twice more, she pulled on her coat and boots, tucking the revolver into her pocket. She moved quickly across the yard, the snow crunching under her feet, her breath puffing white in the cold air. The object was small, no larger than her palm. When she picked it up, a chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a wooden carving, a sparrow, almost identical to the one Eli had given her, but rougher, the edges jagged and uneven. She turned it over in her hand. The back was carved with a single word, soon. Her stomach dropped. She shoved the carving into her coat pocket and hurried back to the house, locking the door behind her. She fed the fire higher, as if the heat could push back the cold that had seeped into her bones. Thomas whimpered, and she lifted him into her arms, rocking him until he calmed. But her mind kept circling back to the carving. It wasn't a random gesture. Whoever left it knew about the sparrow in Thomas's crib. They'd been close enough to see it, or close enough to hear about it from someone who had. The hours until Eli's return stretched painfully long. She tried not to pace, but found herself moving from window to window, scanning the white fields and dark tree lines. When the sound of hooves finally reached her ears, she felt both relief and a surge of urgency. Eli rode up fast, his face grim. He dismounted in one motion, boots crunching on the packed snow, and stepped inside without taking off his coat. "What happened?" he asked, his eyes narrowing the moment he saw her expression. She pulled the carving from her pocket and set it on the table. "This was left at the fence, a man on foot. I didn't open the door, I stayed inside until he left." Eli picked it up, turning it over in his hand. His fingers tightened around it. "Soon," he read aloud, his voice low. He looked at her, and there was no mistaking the anger in his eyes. Cold, controlled, but deep. "They've been watching the house close," he said. "Close enough to know about the sparrow I made for Thomas. This isn't just a warning, Nora. It's a promise." Her throat was dry. "What do they want?" He set the carving down carefully as though it might break. "They want me unsettled. They think if they push hard enough I'll make a mistake." "And if you do?" she asked. His gaze locked with hers, unflinching. "I won't." He moved then, checking the locks on the doors and windows, setting a second rifle by the back door. "From now on, no stepping outside unless I'm with you. Not to the barn, not even to the porch." That night the wind rose again, rattling the shutters and carrying the distant sound of coyotes across the frozen fields. Nora lay awake with Thomas tucked close, listening to the steady creak of Eli's chair by the door. The firelight threw shifting patterns on the walls, catching the edge of the wooden sparrow in the crib and the rougher one on the table. 2 sparrows side by side, one a gift, the other a threat. She stared at them until the lines blurred, wondering which would decide the days ahead. And somewhere beyond the ridge, she imagined a man's voice saying that single word again. Not a question, not a warning, but a certainty. Soon. The next day dawned grey and heavy, the kind of sky that promised more snow before nightfall. The light was dim even at mid-morning, shadows pooling in the corners of the room. Eli didn't leave the house. He kept moving from window to window, rifle always within reach, his eyes narrowing each time they lingered on the tree line. Nora stayed close to the hearth, Thomas in her lap, the 2 sparrows on the table between them. The one Eli had made was smooth and warm, a comfort. The other was rough, splintered, and cold no matter how long it sat near the fire. She kept glancing at it, as though it might somehow change if she stared long enough. By midday, the snow began to fall slow at first, then faster, the flakes thick and heavy. The wind stayed low, making the air eerily still. Eli paused near the back window, his voice quiet but sharp. "Riders?" Nora's heart jumped. "How many?" "3, coming from the ridge." His eyes didn't leave the view. "They're not here to talk this time." He moved quickly, handing her the revolver. "Take Thomas into the cellar, bar the door. Don't come out until I say." Her breath came fast. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," he said. But there was something in his tone, steady, certain, that told her he was lying. She wanted to argue, to refuse, but the sound of hooves crunching in the snow cut her short. She scooped up Thomas, grabbing the smooth sparrow and tucking it into his blanket, then hurried to the trapdoor in the corner. She looked back once before climbing down, catching Eli's eyes. There was no fear there, only a fierce, unmovable resolve. In the dark cellar, the air was cold and damp. She sat on an overturned crate, Thomas quiet against her chest and strained to hear above the pounding of her own pulse. Muffled voices came from above, men calling out, demanding. Eli's voice answered, low and sharp. Then the crack of a rifle split the air. Thomas flinched, and she held him tighter, murmuring to soothe him. More shots followed, quick and close, the sound echoing through the floor. Then silence. Her heart hammered in the quiet. She wanted to climb up, to see, but her legs wouldn't move. She forced herself to wait, the seconds dragging like hours, until finally the trapdoor creaked open. Eli's face appeared, pale with cold but unhurt. "It's over," he said. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Come on." She climbed out, clutching Thomas. The front door was open, snow drifting in over the threshold. Beyond it, 2 riderless horses stood stamping in the yard, their reins trailing in the snow. A third figure lay face down near the fence, unmoving. Eli shut the door, his eyes on her. "They won't be back, not these ones." She swallowed hard, still trembling. "You could have been." "I wasn't," he said, firmly cutting her off. He reached out, brushing a hand lightly over Thomas's head. "You're both safe. That's all that matters." Her eyes stung, the weight of the past weeks pressing down all at once, the storm, the riders, the knocks in the night, the carved warning. And through it all, Eli standing between her and whatever waited outside. She looked at him then, really looked at the lines on his face, the steadiness in his eyes, the quiet strength that had never once wavered. "When you said I'd stay forever," she murmured, "I thought you meant because you were stubborn." "I am," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "But I also meant it." His gaze softened, though the steel never left it. "Not because you have to, because you'll want to." She glanced toward the table where the 2 sparrows still sat side by side. The rough one was gone. Only Eli's carving remained, its smooth wings catching the firelight. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, covering the tracks in the yard. The world beyond the fence was still dangerous, still wide and cold, but here, in this house, there was warmth, there was safety. Nora shifted Thomas in her arms, the boy's small hand brushing the sparrow. For the first time since she'd set foot on the ranch, she let herself believe they might truly belong here. Eli stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "The storm's not done," he said, nodding toward the window, "but we'll see it through, together." And as she met his eyes, Nora knew that whatever else lay ahead, snow, wind, danger, it would not find her alone again.